Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning into this story. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. My name is Milo Burnett, and it has been just over a month since we escaped Black Drift Correctional Facility. When we last saw any semblance of normalcy, we were holed up at the old Marsh Ranger station, hoping for rescue. Our group with me, it's Fitz, Dean, and Officer Lowe, was running on low supplies and uncertain hope. Carter, our fellow survivor, lost his life to the infection, and his final moments almost cost us everything. At times, I still wonder if there might have been a way to save him. But that's all in the past. In the days that followed our initial arrival at the ranger station, we settled into a grim routine. We barred the doors with wooden beams, gathered whatever non-perishable items we could find in the station's cabinets, and rationed everything down to the last crumb. Rainwater served as our main source of hydration. We rigged tarps over buckets to collect whatever the Florida skies sent down. We took turns monitoring the radio that had given us faint glimmers of outside contact. Most of the time, it returned only static. Occasionally, we'd pick up a scrambled message telling us to remain in place, that quarantines were active all across the region. None of the garbled voices offered a timeline for aid. We could only assume that whatever had started at Blackdrift was spreading. During daylight, we ventured into the swamp in pairs, looking for anything edible. Fruits, edible roots, small creatures. Once, Dean managed to catch a fish near a shallow stream, and we carefully cooked it over a small fire behind the station, using a makeshift grill made out of scrap metal. The taste was mediocre, but the protein kept us going. All the while, we never stopped watching for the infected. For the first week, we didn't see any sign of them beyond the perimeter of our station. We believed that the swamp's dangerous terrain might have slowed or deterred them. But as the second week rolled in, we began encountering them deeper in the marsh. Figures shuffling through shallow water with blank, unseeing faces. Some wore scraps of prison uniforms or guard attire. Others were in tattered civilian clothing we didn't recognize. The infection had clearly spread beyond Black Drift's fences. The more we observed these creatures, the more we learned. They appeared sensitive to noise, so we took care to stay quiet, especially when we moved through areas where the muddy ground could cause us to slip and create a commotion. We noticed that at certain times of day, especially in intense midday heat, they seemed almost sluggish, as if weighed down by the humidity and the thick swamp air. But come dusk, when temperatures cooled a bit, they seemed a little more active. We set up basic traps around the station to keep them away. Empty cans strung on fishing line to create noise when disturbed. Sharpened stakes hammered into a low barricade around the building's perimeter. Fitz showed us how to rig an improvised tripwire from an old extension cord. We covered the line with leaves and used it to alert us if anything drew too close. Each morning, we'd check for disturbances. Usually, the lines were intact. Sometimes we found them snapped, as though something large had passed by. The true horror arrived in the third week, when we saw our first mutated infected. We were returning from a supply run. Dean spotted a shape crouched near the water's edge, behind a cluster of cypress knees. By that point, we were accustomed to the infected's lurching gait, but this one, it was different. Its shape was distorted, perhaps from fungal growth or internal changes. In the dim light, we could see swelling along its limbs, as if something under the skin had grown beyond normal proportions. It made a faint rattling sound, as though struggling to breathe. We retreated before it noticed us. Dean and I crept back to the station to warn the others. Later, from a distance, we tried to observe its behavior through binoculars. It lumbered in a slow circle, occasionally dragging its left leg in a jerky motion. Its eyes were glazed like the others, but it moved its head in short, twitchy bursts, as though listening for something specific. Officer Lowe, still nursing his injured shoulder, suggested that maybe the virus had adapted to the swamp environment. The fungal spores out here were rumored to be unique. Whatever the explanation, the infection was no longer a simple matter of mindless aggression. Some of the infected had changed in unpredictable ways, making them even more dangerous to approach. By the beginning of the 4th week, we knew we couldn't remain at the ranger station indefinitely. Our supplies were nearly gone. Officer Lowe's injury needed better care, and with more infected wandering close, our location felt compromised. Fitz unearthed references in old station logs about a secondary outpost run by local game wardens. We had considered seeking it out, but the real deciding factor came when Dean discovered something far more concerning. A file folder labeled with the Margrave Biotech logo tucked behind a locked drawer in the station's back office. Inside was a brief mention of a sub-level lab Blackdrift region. The notes indicated that some research had been done off-site, not just under the prison, but in a separate facility hidden in the marsh. Officer Lowe recognized the name from rumor. He claimed the warden had once mentioned an old hurricane shelter or storage bunker in the deeper part of the Blackrose Marshlands. We realized that if Margrave Biotech had a lab out there, it might have additional resources, medical supplies, information about the virus, maybe even a clue to reversing it. Admittedly, we hesitated. Entering a secret laboratory possibly overrun by mutated infected sounded like a reckless plan, but we were out of options. A single infection in our group could mean disaster. We needed medication, a better knowledge of what we were up against, or at least a chance to find something that could give us an advantage. So, at the tail end of the 4th week, we decided to leave the ranger station behind. We planned our departure carefully. Each of us carried a small pack. Mine contained a makeshift first aid kit, bandages, antiseptic, gauze, a roll of duct tape for any and all emergencies, as well as the few precious cans of food left in our station. Dean carried a portable shortwave radio along with the battered map from the station's wall. Fitz was in charge of our small collection of tools, a multi-tool, a hammer, a handful of nails, and some fishing line. Officer Lowe, still wearing his uniform, now ripped and stained, had the only firearm among us, a standard-issue sidearm with a single magazine left. We prayed we wouldn't need to fire it, because the sound would bring every infected for miles. We woke before dawn. With the first rays of sunlight creeping into the sky, we moved out. A thin mist clung to the marsh, making it difficult to see more than a few dozen yards ahead. We walked in pairs, picking our way around cypress knees and drowned logs. Sometimes we moved in silence for so long that I wondered if the others could sense my inner anxiety. In truth, none of us wanted to speak much. Words couldn't change what we were doing, traveling deeper into a place infested by a nightmare we barely understood. Progress was slow. Water rose to our ankles, then our shins, then back down again as we crossed ridges of slightly higher ground. Every step had to be tested first, with a makeshift staff so we wouldn't tumble into hidden sinkholes. At times, the drone of insects was nearly overwhelming. We used scraps of cloth to cover our faces, more to block the insects than for infection control. By now, we had little hope that face coverings would stop the virus if an infected person got close. By midday, we found a shallow creek and paused to filter water through a piece of cloth. Officer Lowe was shivering slightly. His shoulder didn't look good. The wound had never fully healed, and the damp environment was likely making it worse. Fitz tried to clean it with antiseptic, but we only had so much of that left. The rest of us ate a bit of our limited food supply, then pressed on. Somewhere around mid-afternoon, we stumbled upon a surprising sight. A half-buried cargo container emblazoned with the Margrave Biotech logo, lodged in a swampy gulch. It looked like it had been dropped there, maybe airlifted or carried by a boat. The container's doors were forced open, revealing scattered medical vials and broken equipment inside. Mud and water had ruined most of it. We gathered what we could, but we found nothing obviously useful. Just empty syringes, soggy paperwork, and a few sealed plastic packages labeled sterile gauze. Still, it was a clue that we were on the right track. Margrave Biotech had some sort of operation deeper in these wetlands, and we were getting closer to its remnants. As we continued, the environment began to change. Cypress trees gave way to denser clusters of brush. We noticed old wooden signposts leaning at odd angles, their paint flaking. The writing was too faded to read clearly, but it reminded us that people once traveled these paths for reasons other than survival. By dusk, we were exhausted. We set up a small camp on a dry patch of ground near a crooked willow tree. Fitz and I used stakes and rope to create a rudimentary perimeter line. We hung empty cans along the rope so any contact would rattle them. We stayed awake in shifts. 2 kept watch while the other 2 rested. It wasn't peaceful, but it was the best we could manage. In the dim light, insects buzzed around us relentlessly. The night sky was overcast, offering little moonlight. The swamp felt alive with hidden movement. Once or twice, we heard distant splashing, but it never approached. I'm not sure if that was a blessing or an ominous sign that something was circling. When dawn arrived, we packed up quickly. Fitz scouted ahead, climbing onto a fallen log to get a better vantage. After a few moments, he waved us forward. Officer Lowe and I followed, helping Dean over a slippery mound. Beyond that, we saw a fence. It was chain link topped with rusted wire, partially camouflaged by vines and overgrown brush. The fence spanned across the marsh in a roughly rectangular shape, disappearing into clusters of vegetation. A small sign on the fence read, "Property of Margrave Biotech, authorized personnel only." It looked as though part of the fence had collapsed into the water. This might have been the outer perimeter of the facility we'd heard about. If so, the actual entrance was probably further inside. We searched for a gate or some kind of opening, eventually finding a locked metal door. Fitz tried a handful of keys we'd taken from the warden's office, but none fit. In the end, we slipped through a gap where the fence had buckled near the waterline. Inside, the ground was more solid, as if artificially reinforced. We noticed old asphalt crumbling under the moss. A signpost that might have once pointed to different areas of the compound lay on the ground. The direction arrows were snapped off, but one piece had an arrow with faint letters. Lab sublevel. We exchanged looks. This was probably it. We navigated further in, following an overgrown footpath lined with ancient floodlights. The structures we spotted were mostly battered sheds or small outbuildings. Many had caved-in roofs. Some bore more Margrave Biotech markings, suggesting storage or power stations. The overall layout hinted at an underground facility, just as the notes implied. Then we saw them, mutated, infected, up close. A cluster of 5 or 6 wandered near a broken fence, blocking our path. Their forms were twisted. One had swollen limbs and a large growth on its torso, which might have been some kind of fungal mass. Another had an elongated neck, as though the virus had expanded tissues in unnatural ways. They moved erratically, emitting soft rasping sounds. We dropped to our knees behind a warped steel barrel, gesturing for silence. Officer Lowe clutched his sidearm, but we all knew firing was a last resort. Fitz quietly readied a makeshift spear, fashioned from a sharpened metal rod. Dean slowly reached into his bag for a length of fishing line, which we'd sometimes used to lure infected away by throwing it attached to a noise-making object. We watched as the infected meandered, occasionally bumping into each other. Their eyes were unfocused, but they seemed agitated, as if searching for something. One of them jerked its head to the side in a spasm, then continued forward. The path we needed to follow lay directly behind them. Dean looked at me, then carefully tied a small chunk of metal to a length of line. He motioned that he would toss it to the right, hoping to draw them away. I nodded. He swung the line in a silent arc and flung the metal chunk across the clearing. It landed in the brush with a clatter. Immediately the infected twitched, turning toward the noise. One by one, they lumbered in that direction. We waited until they had moved off, then slipped by quietly, stepping around soggy debris. It was the closest call we'd had in weeks. My nerves felt taut, but I couldn't voice the feeling openly. We had to remain focused. We pressed forward into what looked like a small courtyard in front of a larger building. The building itself had multiple levels, but the windows were boarded up from the inside. A tall sign out front was too worn to read. However, We could see a pair of double doors, battered but still intact, with the Margrave logo faintly visible above them. Getting inside wasn't easy. The front doors wouldn't budge. They might have been barricaded from within. We circled around, finding a side entrance that stood ajar, its metal frame bent as if forced open by powerful hands. We carefully stepped into a dim corridor that smelled of mold and stale air. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, powered by who knew what. Maybe an emergency generator somewhere still chugged along, or maybe partial solar panels. The hallway was littered with overturned chairs, broken glass, and damp papers. We moved with caution, shining a single flashlight ahead. Then came the sign that confirmed our suspicions. A directory on the wall that read "Sub-level access," with an arrow pointing down a nearby staircase. Below that, smaller letters indicated "Authorized personnel only." We descended carefully, each step echoing faintly. The deeper we went, the more we realized how large this place was. Multiple sub-levels, each presumably for different research areas. The documents we'd found suggested there might have been an entire operation here, possibly parallel to the prison's own lab. On the first sub-level landing, we discovered what looked like a security checkpoint. A cracked monitor displayed a looping error message. The gate itself was half-lowered, jammed with a metal filing cabinet. Fitz squeezed under it first, shining the flashlight around. The corridor beyond was lined with lab doors, each with a small square window. Some were shattered, others were fogged up or smeared with something we didn't want to identify. We spent a few minutes searching the offices. We found desks strewn with old paperwork, half-empty storage closets with scattered lab coats and rubber gloves. One room had several locked cabinets. We managed to pry one open and discovered boxes of simple medical supplies, latex gloves, face shields, some basic first aid materials, and a half-dozen sealed pouches of something labeled IV nutrient solution. Not exactly the cure for an unknown infection, but better than nothing. Most crucially, we uncovered a partial map of the sub-level. It showed an access corridor leading down to a deeper floor labeled Contamination Control Lab. That area was marked with the highest clearance rating. Before venturing deeper, we took stock of our new supplies in one of the unoccupied labs. The door had a functioning lock, which gave us at least a little security. There, we decided to wait and observe the pattern of any infected that might roam the halls. For the next several hours, we listened in silence, occasionally hearing distant scraping or muffled steps, but no direct approach. To pass the time, we examined logs on the computers scattered around. Dean managed to power one terminal using an emergency battery stored in a drawer. Old documents revealed that Margrave Biotech had been testing a compound named TH04, the same reference we'd seen at the prison. Initial notes mentioned promising results in boosting immune responses. Then a later entry highlighted adverse interactions with local spores, which apparently caused unpredictable tissue changes. We felt a twinge of unease when we read about Stage 2 mutations, referencing physical alterations beyond normal human parameters, precisely what we'd begun seeing in the swamp. A note near the bottom read, "Containment protocol, immediate quarantine. Monitor for advanced coordination in mutated subjects." Advanced coordination? The idea of infected working together, even in a rudimentary way, was unsettling. That evening, we made a plan. Fitz suggested we split up in short intervals to explore the corridor. Officer Lowe would stay in the locked lab, resting his shoulder and keeping watch over our supplies. His condition remained fragile. Dean and I volunteered to check a small medical storage room indicated on the map, hoping to find something more substantial than basic gauze. Fitz would scout a hallway leading toward biotesting. We agreed to regroup after an hour. Dean and I crept into the corridor, flashlight beams bobbing across cracked floor tiles. Pipes overhead dripped occasionally. The walls were scuffed with random bullet marks. At one point we passed a door labeled Specimen Prep, which had been torn from its hinges. Inside, the few tables remained upright, but the overhead light flickered. Vials and shattered containers littered the floor, covered in a thin layer of mold. We kept moving, stepping around the debris. A short walk later, we found the door for medical storage B3. It was locked, but the lock looked basic. Dean tried using a small flathead screwdriver from Fitz's toolkit. After a couple of tense minutes, we heard a satisfying click. The door eased open, revealing shelves from floor to ceiling. Many were empty or rifled through, but we took our time inspecting each. We found a few sealed boxes of antibiotics, some saline bags, and a small stock of antiseptic wipes. This was a major improvement over what we had at the ranger station. We even discovered a functioning mini-fridge in the corner. Its digital panel glowed faintly, meaning some power still flowed here. Inside were 2 vials labeled anti-inflammatory compound, with instructions for injection. It might help Officer Lowe, though we had no illusions it was a cure. Still, every little bit helped. Our relief was short-lived. Just as Dean was stowing the supplies in his backpack, we heard a sound from the corridor, a dragging shuffle, accompanied by wheezing. We froze and turned off the flashlight, pressing ourselves behind a tall shelving unit. The door was cracked open, letting in a sliver of light from the hallway. The shuffle grew louder. Something moved past the doorway, then paused. Our pulses thudded in our ears, careful to avoid phrases like "heart pounded" as requested. I pictured one of those mutated forms sniffing the air, listening for us. After a moment, the sound resumed, receding into the distance. Dean and I exhaled quietly and waited a full minute before creeping out. The hallway was empty. We hurried back the way we came, checking corners to avoid any unexpected encounters. We returned to the locked lab where Officer Lowe waited, only to find Fitz already there, pacing. He claimed he had scouted a hallway that led to a locked door with the sign, "Biotesting, restricted." The small window beside it revealed a darkened stairwell leading further down. He was sure he heard movement behind that door. We agreed to investigate it as a group once we ensured that Officer Lowe's shoulder was tended to. Officer Lowe administered one of the anti-inflammatory injections, sighing with relief as he felt some pressure lessen around his injury. Meanwhile, Dean sifted through the notes and vials we'd gathered, trying to see if anything referenced an antidote. A partial log was among the items we found in the medical storage. It described attempts to treat infected subjects with the TH04 formula reversed, combined with antifungal agents. The result was always the same. The infected bodies reacted violently, leading to more severe mutations or total organ failure. No mention of success, no sign of a cure. We did, however, find references to certain vulnerabilities. In the notes, a test group of infected displayed markedly slow healing in humid conditions if exposed to chemical agents containing sulfur. Another note mentioned that bright light seemed to disorient them temporarily, though not consistently. It wasn't a solution, but it might give us a slight edge. We considered rigging a bright flash or chemical mixture if we had the right supplies. Seeing how extensive Margrave Biotech's research was, we felt certain that the deeper floors might hold more advanced data, or at least tools we could use. Fitz summarized our goal. If there's any chance they worked on a genuine countermeasure, it would be in the high-security labs. Yet we also understood that those labs were probably the most dangerous areas. If advanced testing occurred there, advanced mutations might be roaming the corridors. Still, we had come this far. Risking everything to reach what we hoped was an opportunity to turn the tables. We decided to move out again at daybreak, or at least whatever passed for daybreak down here. In truth, the sublevels were a world of constant artificial light and darkness, dictated by flickering bulbs and half-dead power lines. We sealed the door of the lab from the inside and settled in for a restless night. The faint hum of electronics and the drip of overhead pipes was our lullaby. Occasionally we caught ourselves listening for distant noises, footsteps, metal scraping. Each time we held our breath and waited. No direct threats materialized, but a thick tension hung in the stale air. In the morning, we carefully opened the door and stepped back into the corridor. Our destination, the locked biotesting restricted door that Fitz had found. The route was lined with broken emergency lights. We moved slowly, scanning for movement. Twice we saw infected in the distance and ducked into side rooms until they passed. One was definitely mutated. Its torso looked covered in nodules, pulsating slightly. Seeing it from only a few yards away was unsettling. We avoided contact by crouching behind an overturned supply cart. When we finally reached the locked door, Fitz examined the lock. This one looked more secure. We tried the warden's keys again, but came up empty. In the corner near the door, we spotted an electronic keypad connected to a partially active system. Its digital display flickered, showing random characters. This place was battered but not entirely lifeless. Dean attempted to bypass the mechanism by unscrewing the panel and crossing wires inside. It took the better part of 10 minutes, but eventually there was a click and the door slid open a few inches before stalling. Fitz and I wedged our shoulders in, forcing it open far enough for us to squeeze through. Beyond the door was a narrow stairwell, descending in a sharp curve. Faint red lights glowed along the steps, giving it a haunting feel. The air grew colder, and an odd metallic scent lingered. We eased downward, each footstep echoing. At the bottom, we came to another door marked Contamination Control Lab Level 2 in bold letters. Fitz tested the handle. It swung open easily, revealing a large L-shaped corridor. Flickering overhead lights illuminated a series of rooms with reinforced windows. Each door had a nameplate: Test Chamber A, Test Chamber B, Observation Room, Decontamination Chamber, and so on. It felt like we'd stepped into the heart of whatever had started this outbreak. We stuck together, scanning each room one at a time. Test Chamber A contained half a dozen steel tables, overhead light rigs, and a large observation window. On the back wall, scribbled notes hung from a bulletin board. Dean collected them, his eyes darting across the paper. One page mentioned a last-ditch attempt to administer a revised formula to volunteers who had mild symptoms of infection. All had resulted in accelerated spread of the virus. Another note read, "Focus on TH04 variation S. Potential partial remission in early stage cases. Variation S." We flagged that in our minds. Test Chamber B was a different story. It looked like a struggle had occurred. The metal tables were toppled, the overhead rig had crashed onto the floor, and the observation window was cracked. We found no sign of survivors, only scuffed footprints and large smears of residue that might have been from the mutated growths. It appeared the facility's staff tried to contain a subject here, and it broke free. Down the corridor we found a sealed lab with a frosted window. The door read, "Authorized personnel only, TUT-0, 4 Variation S trials." This was the clue we needed. The door's electronic lock was offline, so we resorted to manual force. It took all 4 of us pushing together to budget enough to slip inside. The interior had an array of lab benches, computer terminals, and storage cabinets. Dim emergency lights glowed around the edges of the ceiling. At the far end, a large metal cylinder lay on its side, labeled cryo storage. The top was dented as though something or someone had knocked it over. Shattered glass littered the floor. A faint chemical odor pervaded the air. We split up to search. Fitz rummaged through the cabinets. Dean checked the computers. Officer Lowe stood guard by the door, occasionally pressing a cloth to his shoulder. I approached the cylinder, noticing a small control panel. It had no power, but text on the side indicated it was meant to store sensitive biological materials at extremely low temperatures. Whatever was inside, it might have contained the best chance at an antidote or vaccine. Now it was damaged and presumably useless. Dean called me over to a terminal where he'd found a partial log referencing Variation S. The log described attempts to isolate certain fungal components from the swamp that seemed to bond with the virus. The scientists believed that, under controlled conditions, Variation S could slow the progression of infection in someone recently bitten or exposed, but it required a stable temperature environment and a specialized injection method. Without that, the mixture was unstable. He also found a note referencing growth accelerants, which might have led to the mutated forms. The staff seemed uncertain how to handle the side effects. At the bottom of the log, a final entry read, "All staff evacuated to primary facility or sought cover. Variation S project suspended until further notice." We'd just begun to piece together that Variation S might be the closest thing to a partial cure when a noise from the corridor made us freeze. It was a series of heavy thuds, followed by a dragging sound. Officer Lowe motioned for silence. Fitz crouched behind one of the lab benches, gripping his makeshift spear. Dean dimmed his flashlight. Through the cracked lab window, we saw shapes outside, multiple infected, some heavily mutated. One was especially large, with an expanded torso and limbs. The fungal masses on its body pulsed in the low light. Another had an elongated neck and odd protrusions along its spine. They shuffled closer, drawn by some cue, maybe our footsteps or the faint light from the lab. We glanced at each other, weighing options. The door was our only exit, and the infected were congregating just outside. The terminal near us beeped softly as it attempted to reboot. That small noise might have given us away because suddenly one of the creatures lunged at the door. It rattled on its hinges, producing a loud crash that echoed through the corridor. More infected converged on the sound. Fitz and I scrambled to barricade the door with a heavy metal cabinet. Officer Lowe stood ready, sidearm in hand. We dreaded firing it, but if they broke through, it might be our last line of defense. The creatures pushed and scratched at the steel door. Their raspy exhalations seeped through the cracks. Each impact felt stronger than the last. We realized that among them, there might be advanced forms with greater strength. Dean frantically unplugged the computer's battery supply, hoping to reduce the noise that was drawing them. For a moment, the corridor fell silent except for the infected bashing against the door. Then, with a final heave, part of the metal door frame began to buckle. Officer Lowe glanced at me, then gave a single nod. He raised his weapon and waited. A mutated arm pried through a gap, groping at the air. The largest creature shoved its shoulder into the breach, straining to fit through. The door was coming off its hinges. Officer Lowe squeezed the trigger. The sharp crack reverberated in the enclosed space. The shot caught the creature in the torso. It staggered but didn't stop. Instead, it growled in a harsh, rattling tone, pressing forward again. Another shot. This time it collapsed, blocking part of the doorway. Yet the rest of the horde kept pushing and climbing over their fallen comrade. At least 3 more sets of limbs reached through. We had to find another exit, or we'd be overrun. Fitz yelled, "There's a vent in the corner." I saw it, a large air vent near the ceiling, big enough for a person to crawl through if we removed the grate. Dean and I grabbed a screwdriver, working the fasteners loose. Officer Lowe fired another shot into the corridor, momentarily staggering one infected. The noise echoed, likely drawing more from within the facility. Finally, the grate came free. Fitz went first, hoisting himself into the duct. Officer Lowe handed his sidearm to Dean, who climbed after Fitz. Then Lowe gestured for me to go. He insisted he would follow last. "I can manage," he said quietly. I pulled myself up, heart pounding, but remembering not to use that phrase. My nerves taut, assisting from above as Lua tried to climb in. His shoulder made it agonizing, but he gritted his teeth and pushed through. Meanwhile, the door gave way beneath the weight of the infected. They spilled into the lab, scrabbling at the metal benches. One of them reached for Lowe's ankle just as I grabbed his arm and pulled him inside the vent. We kicked at the creature's searching hand, then dragged the grate shut behind us. The ventilation shaft was cramped and dark, but at least it kept us out of reach. We moved on hands and knees, using a small flashlight to guide us. The moans of the infected echoed behind us, along with scraping against the duct. It sounded like they might try to follow, but the larger ones wouldn't fit. We pushed deeper into the labyrinth of vents, hoping to find a way up or out. After some minutes of crawling, we reached a junction. One path angled downward, labeled sub-level access duct, and the other angled upward, possibly leading back to the main building. We paused. The downward path might lead to another area of the lab, where Variation S was stored or processed. The upward path might lead us closer to an exit. Officer Lowe's labored breathing reminded us that his condition was deteriorating. He needed rest and better medical care. Fitz asked, "Are we really going to search deeper for Variation S, or should we cut our losses and get out?" Dean hesitated, shining the flashlight between the two routes. Then he pointed toward the downward angle. "We came this far. If there's even a small chance that Variation S can help us manage the infection if one of us gets exposed, we should try." I nodded, though a knot formed in my gut. Taking Officer Lowe deeper into danger felt risky, but leaving without exploring all possibilities could mean we'd never find a solution. Reluctantly, we edged our way down the sloping vent. The metal walls became damp, condensation dripping in places. The environment smelled of stagnant air and cleaning chemicals. Our flashlight picked up large dust bunnies and the occasional scurrying insect. At the end of the slope, the duct leveled out, opening onto a grated panel. Through the panel, we saw a wide corridor lit by red emergency lights. A sign on the far wall read, "Biohazard Containment, Authorized Entry Only." Another door near it was labeled, "Secured Storage, Variation S Materials." Our hearts lifted at the sight of it. This had to be the location mentioned in the files. We pried open the grate slowly, mindful of any noise. Dropping into the corridor, we found it flooded with about an inch of water. A pipe overhead must have burst at some point. The place smelled of old chemicals and rust. We shuffled forward, checking side rooms for threats. One was a small control booth with a bank of monitors. Most were cracked or inactive. Another had floor-to-ceiling freezers, all powered off. Their digital panels blinked in error states. Finally, we reached the door labeled Secured Storage, Variation S Materials. Like before, it had an electronic lock that was partially functional. Dean repeated his earlier trick, bypassing wires. The door's panel sputtered, then glowed green. We tugged the handle, and it swung inward. Inside was a surprisingly organized space. Rows of metal shelves stacked with canisters, vials, and data drives. Some of the canisters had toppled over, and a few were missing lids. The floor was littered with packing material. In the center stood a large steel refrigerator unit with a hazy glass front. A digital screen on top read, "Power failure, temperature unstable." We carefully moved in, shining the flashlight across the shelves. Labels read things like TH04 base, TH04 variation A, TH04 variation S, and more. Some were accompanied by long chemical names I couldn't pronounce. Many of the containers were cracked or had leaked. A pungent odor filled the room, reminiscent of vinegar and ammonia. Fitz found a row of intact vials near the back, each labeled Variation S, Final Batch. They were stored in what looked like a foam-insulated box. Dean checked the box. The vials were warm to the touch. If they required refrigeration, their efficacy might be compromised, but it was the only lead we had. We packed 4 vials into a small insulated pouch we found on a side shelf, hoping that partial cooling from the damp environment might help. A scattering of notes pinned to the shelf described how Variation S was meant to be injected soon after infection to slow the virus's progression. No guarantee of a complete cure, but it might keep someone from turning as quickly. We were about to leave when we heard something large moving just beyond the door, metal scraping against the corridor floor. Officer Lowe gestured for us to kill the flashlight. We sank behind the shelves. The scraping sound paused, followed by a low, wheezing moan. It seemed heavier than an ordinary infected, possibly a mutated variant with enhanced strength or size. We waited in silence, straining our ears. The footsteps resumed, accompanied by a wet dragging. It passed the door but didn't enter. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds faded into the distance. We took that chance to slip out into the corridor. My pulse raced at the possibility that a truly formidable creature lurked so close, but we had to keep moving. Clutching our newly acquired Variation S files, we retraced our path toward the vent. Our plan was to retreat to the upper levels and, if possible, exit the facility. We had minimal ammunition left, and our group was fatigued. Officer Lowe's shoulder was in rough shape, but the anti-inflammatory agent from earlier had kept him going. He insisted he could make it out if we moved carefully. We returned to the vent entrance without encountering any infected, which was surprising and unsettling. Maybe they were drawn elsewhere by the gunshots from earlier. Maybe they were massing somewhere deeper in the facility. We couldn't be sure. We re-entered the duct, climbing back up to the previous sub-level. The labyrinthine passages felt more like a trap with every minute we spent inside. At last, we emerged into the corridor near the biotesting area. The door we had broken open earlier was still ajar, revealing the damage done when the infected broke in. We tiptoed past the scene, stepping over scattered debris. There were fewer infected bodies than we expected. Some might have dragged themselves elsewhere. The sight was grim, but we pushed forward, focusing on the exit. When we reached the stairwell leading back to the main building, we found the metal door again jammed. It required manual force to move, so Fitz, Dean, and I shoved it until it creaked open just enough for us to slip through. Officer Lowe, wincing, joined us in the stairwell. We ascended each step carefully, checking corners. The lighting was even worse here than before, with only the occasional flicker giving us glimpses of the path. Finally, we made it to the ground-level corridor. Beyond a pair of double doors, we spotted faint daylight filtering in through cracks in the boarded windows. We were close to the outside world. We hurried down the hallway, passing offices and storage closets. A muffled moan made us pause, but no infected emerged. With each step, the slivers of sunlight grew brighter. Then we reached the front entrance, still blocked from the inside by heavy debris. We had to remove a fallen support beam and shift a large metal table. It took all four of us pushing. While we worked, we heard distant shuffling and moaning echoing from other parts of the building. We moved as fast as we could. Finally, we cleared a path wide enough to slip through the battered doors. Stepping outside felt like emerging from a dark cave. The sun was high, casting reflections off the marshy water that surrounded the facility. We saw no immediate infected in the courtyard. Perhaps they had wandered off or were still inside. We wasted no time, hurrying across the overgrown asphalt toward the perimeter fence. At the fence, we found the spot where we'd entered. Water lapped at the gap, concealing our path. We carefully waded through, pushing aside the chain link to squeeze out. After a final scramble, we were back in the open swamp. The relief was temporary. The threat of roving infected still loomed, but at least we weren't trapped underground. We moved away from the facility, aiming to find higher ground. The Variation S vials weighed on our minds. Were they stable? Could they truly slow the infection if one of us was ever exposed? We had no illusions that it was a miraculous cure, but it might keep someone alive long enough to seek proper treatment, if such a thing even existed. That night, we camped in a dry hollow among cypress roots, rigging our cantraps and tripwires again. Officer Lowe administered another anti-inflammatory shot. He seemed more alert, though still weaker than before. Dean pored over the notes we'd gathered, hoping to decipher more about Variation S or the mutated forms. Fitz kept watch at the edge of our small camp, scanning the darkness with a flashlight that was starting to dim. Around a small contained fire, we discussed our next steps. Should we return to the ranger station? Should we push further out into the marsh, looking for a rumored safe zone or a route to civilization? None of us had real answers. We'd gleaned enough to know that the virus had progressed beyond anyone's control in this region. The location of any official quarantine zone or rescue operation was unknown. Still, we took a moment to acknowledge that we'd found something. Variation S might be the difference between total despair and a slim chance. And that small chance was better than we had before. By morning, the fog rolled in thick, muffling sounds and limiting visibility to a few yards. We decided to begin a slow trek back toward the ranger station, at least as a temporary rallying point. Along the way, we did our best to avoid sightings of infected. We spotted a few lone wanderers, but no massive group or heavily mutated forms. Maybe they congregated closer to the facility now, drawn by the echoes of our confrontation. Officer Lowe managed the journey without collapsing, which was a good sign. Dean rationed our final bits of canned food. Fitz occasionally scouted ahead to find the safest path around waterlogged ditches. We took frequent breaks, mindful that traveling too quickly could lead us into an ambush. When we finally neared the ranger station area, the landscape felt both familiar and unsettlingly quiet. The station itself still stood, leaning slightly where the foundation had settled. Our improvised barricades around the perimeter remained in place, though some of the rope lines had slackened or broken. We approached carefully, checking for any unwanted guests inside. The place was as we left it. No sign of intrusion beyond some muddy footprints near the back door. Possibly wildlife or a stray infected. We slipped inside and began refortifying. Fitz took stock of leftover supplies. Dean set out a small battery to power the shortwave radio. Officer Lowe collapsed into a chair, relieved to be off his feet. I rummaged through the station's drawers, looking for anything we might have missed. Finding nothing new, I joined Dean at the radio. He tried multiple frequencies, but the only thing we caught was fragments of static. That, and once, a faint garbled voice that might have said, "All areas under quarantine, do not approach." Then the signal faded. We dedicated the next couple of days to resting, regaining our strength, and figuring out how to store the Variation S vials. We set up a rudimentary cooling system, sealed them in a thermal bag with layers of wet cloth, placed in the station's cooler part of the interior. It wasn't ideal, but hopefully enough to prolong the shelf life. During that time, we tested a small sample of Variation S on decaying tissue from one of the infected we found outside, an arm that had washed into the swamp. We didn't describe it in graphic detail, just enough for curiosity. The results were inconclusive. It was difficult to run any real test. The best we could do was see if the tissue reacted. There was a slight fizz, which might indicate a chemical reaction. Perhaps the formula attacked some aspect of the infection. It was hardly scientific proof, but it fueled cautious optimism. We also refined our traps around the station, adding pointed stakes hidden under shallow water near the perimeter, tying more cans on lines to amplify any disturbance. Our biggest fear was that a horde of mutated infected would eventually track us down. The radio silence suggested we wouldn't be rescued soon. Survival was up to us. A week passed in relative calm. We took shifts guarding the station, rationed our supplies carefully, and continued to watch for any sign of organized rescue. None came. Instead, we documented everything we knew: the virus's progression, its mutation in the swamp environment, the data about Variation S. We wanted to keep a record that might help future survivors or, if we were lucky, real scientists who could develop a better cure. We shared quiet conversations around our small cookfire, remembering Carter and how close we all came to destruction when he fell ill. We vowed to be more vigilant about infection. The Variation S vials could buy time if someone got scratched or exposed, but it was no magic bullet. Caution was our best defense. Officer Lowe's shoulder showed signs of gradual improvement with careful cleaning and the new supplies. Fitz speculated that if we could find a real doctor or hospital, Lowe might fully recover. That became our new goal: to discover a path beyond the swamp, locate any functional medical facility, and see if we could pass along the Variation S data. The entire region might have deteriorated into chaos by now, but perhaps pockets of order remained. Dean worked tirelessly with the shortwave radio, scanning every channel. One evening, he picked up a faint signal mentioning a settlement on the western edge of the marsh, near an old logging road. The message was unclear, but it used words like safe zone and encampment. It could be a rumor or a trap, or it could be real hope. We discussed the possibilities, eventually deciding that staying put forever was not viable. If the settlement existed, it might be our chance to rejoin a fragment of civilization. So we stand at the edge of another choice. Our gear is packed. We have Variation S stowed safely, meager food supplies, and enough knowledge to avoid some of the infected dangers. The question is whether we risk a journey to this rumored settlement, trusting that we can make it through the swamp alive, or do we remain here, in the ranger station that has sheltered us, waiting for an uncertain rescue that might never arrive. A month has passed since we first tasted freedom from Blackdrift's walls. In that time, we've witnessed the virus evolve, turning once human inmates and staff into distorted remnants driven by primal aggression. We've learned how to set traps, how to quietly slip past them, and how to survive with minimal comforts. But we can't ignore the truth. The clock is ticking, and we either move forward or risk being overtaken by the unstoppable tide of the infection. If we leave, we carry with us the possibility that Variation S might help others. If we stay, we might remain alive a little longer in these walls. But eventually, we'd run out of options. The world out there might be harsh, but it's still the world, and maybe there are other survivors who need what we've found. I write these final words in the station's logbook, the same place where I recorded our previous ordeal. My name is Milo Burnett. I was once just an inmate trying to reduce my sentence by turning on old associates. I never imagined I'd face a reality where a virus turned people into infected beings, or that I'd crawl through secret biotech labs in search of a last-ditch formula. Yet here we are, forging a life amid the ruins, bound by hope and necessity. Tomorrow at dawn, we plan to head west. Officer Lowe can manage short hikes if we pace ourselves. Fitz and Dean will lead, armed with our knowledge of the swamp. We'll keep a low profile, set traps if needed, and push through the undergrowth until we find a path or a signpost, leading us somewhere, anywhere, beyond the domain of Blackdrift's legacy. I don't know what we'll find out there, perhaps a settlement or perhaps only more infected, but I believe we have to try. If the human race is to outlast this outbreak, we need to push forward, share what we've learned, and hold on to the slim hope that Variation S can keep someone from losing everything. So, 1 month after the start of this nightmare, we set forth again into the unknown, determined not just to survive, but to give ourselves and anyone else we meet a reason to keep fighting. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.